Hello guys, today we will be in Subunit 3, Lesson 7. Subunit 3, Lesson 7. Per usual, go ahead and spend 5 minutes in our vocabulary section. Vocab, let's go on to activity 2. We will be reading a different narrative today, so a new piece of writing, and this is by Caitlin Greenidge, and she wrote this in 2016. It's called My Mother's Garden. I am going to play this, but I will be stopping every now and then to explain a few things, so listen to it through my computer instead of pausing here.
My Mother's Garden. It was my first year as a scholarship student at a school that prized itself on teaching the skill of dispassionate debate. I quickly learned that the best thing you could bring to an argument was objectivity.
All right, let's automatically pause right there. Let's look up this word, dispassionate. That means cool and emotionless. So she's saying that the school she's going to prized itself. That means they valued teaching cool and emotionless debate. So instead of people getting really worked up, they were able to keep their cool. And the best thing you could do was have objectivity.
We practiced this objectivity in our current events class. It was never explicitly tied to identity, but it was implied.
Objectivity means to not have personal feelings. So when you're having these debates, they wanted people to not include their own personal experiences, but to just have a unbiased point of view.
I learned that the best person to talk about wealth and class was an upper middle class person because she supposedly could look at it dispassionately. The best person to talk about race was a white person for the same reasons. The best person to talk about gender was a boy.
So what she's meaning by that is she learned that people who don't have a lot of skin in the game are the ones that are allowed and do really well in these debates.
When people affected by issues spoke for themselves, they got too angry, too weepy, too irrational. In the mid-1990s, the biggest threat to America continued to be the welfare queen.
So welfare is financial aid provided by the government.
Or at least that's what the news and many politicians all said. My school was far too genteel to name the welfare queen outright, but she haunted our balanced class discussions.
So genteel means polite. So what they mean by that is they never explicitly said that a welfare queen was somebody that was Black, but they implied it very often.
The welfare queen was worse than disease and death and the destruction of the ice caps. She was worse than that because she was all those things in one, perpetually pregnant with pathologies, birthing out criminals and addicts and losers, and apparently eating $50 steaks and driving gleaming Cadillacs while doing so.
So the point of that right there is the stereotypes, right? So people who were stereotyping those that got welfare tried to say, these people are always pregnant, they're always sick, their kids are always criminals, they're drug addicts, they're losers, and then they don't spend their money wisely and have, nice cars and eat out all the time. So this has a lot to do with stereotypes, is what she's talking about here.
I was acutely aware that, on the surface, I could potentially fit all the stereotypes of the welfare queen. I was Black, the daughter of a single mother, on welfare and food stamps, and living in the projects. I would sit in class and listen to the sons and daughters of doctors and lawyers and policymakers, people who had never needed and would most likely never need welfare, earnestly advocate the dismantling of the welfare state. And I would shake and shake and shake with something I couldn't name.
So here she's talking about she has a scholarship. So she's going to a school where people have to pay to go there, which would be most likely pretty expensive. And so if it says the sons and daughters of doctors and lawyers and policymakers, that helps me understand that the school is going to contain a lot of well off and rich people. And so these people who have never been on welfare, haven't needed welfare, or probably never need welfare, they are earnestly, they're seriously advocating, arguing in favor of dismantling, taking apart the welfare state. So they're trying to argue that welfare should not be given to people, that people should not be given government assistance when they do not make enough money.
I told myself it did not matter that my classmates and teachers described a reality that was not mine, was never mine, was so far removed from mine as to be a fiction. Their fiction was the truth, because they didn't live in my reality. That's what made them objective. I wanted to be objective too. I longed for that voice and the authority that came with it. My objective classmates did not know, for instance, about the garden. The housing project we lived in had been built just before the war on poverty, probably intended for GIs returning from World War II. They were suburban-style tract houses, 2 units to each trim building. No one came to visit us there in the bad part of town. We had arrived not that long before, when we were a month away from homelessness. But I did not look at this as a place of shelter. The other people in these projects were nearly all white. We were one of the few Black families.
So already she is showing that the stereotypes that people have aren't true. So again, projects are, what they mean by that is that these are houses built by the government, owned by the government, and they are rented to people who don't make a lot of money. They have to make less than a certain amount in order to help them have a place to live. And so, as we saw earlier, people stereotype people on welfare as Black. And right here she says most people that lived there were white. She was one of the few Black families. So that would be showing that the stereotype of all people who receive assistance are Black is just not true.
The project's tract houses stood behind green lawns and weeping willow trees and generous black-topped driveways. To an outsider, there was little distinction between where we lived and the middle-class homes across the street. But everyone in our town knew which side of the street was which side was where the real people lived, and which side was to be avoided. So when I answered the doorbell one spring afternoon when I was 14, I was very curious. I could see 4 children, smaller than me, the oldest probably no more than 8, the youngest barely 4. "Where's the lady?" the oldest one asked. She had a hoarse voice with a strong Boston accent, and her green eyes blinked up at me from behind a pair of blue plastic glasses, the lenses clouded with finger grease. "Who?" I said. "A lady," the girl repeated. "She works in the garden. We want to work in the garden." Which to my ears sounded like garden. As soon as the ground thawed in this strange new place, my mother started planning a garden. She'd chosen a circle of lawn along the parking lot in the no man's land between the project and the street behind it, where the middle-class homes resumed. She planted cherry tomatoes and cucumbers and marigolds. A garden was my mother's way of holding on, as tightly as she could, to any scrap of our former middle-class life. In our homes before poverty, before the divorce, we had always had a garden. When I was younger, my mother would give me my own small plot. I always chose to plant pansies.
So she mentions a life before they lived in this project housing. So they did, it sounds like the divorce, her parents got divorced, and that's what caused her mom to not be able to afford the housing they had been in before.
My mother had decided to go back to school for a master's degree. She did not want us to stay in this housing project forever. But, as she told me, the housing project administrators argued that her scholarships to graduate school should count as her income, and that even though she was also working, being a full-time student meant she could not live in public housing.
So right there is a conflict. Her mother wants to further her education, to get a better job, to be able to pull themselves out of the situation, but the people in charge, the managers of the housing, said that her scholarship counts as income, and you're not allowed to be a full-time student and also live in these houses.
There were other strange rules, too. My father unexpectedly sent a desktop computer instead of back payments for child support. But the housing project forbade personal computers because they used up too much electricity. My mother made a quick calculation. Hours and gas spent driving back and forth to the university computer lab to work on papers versus the cash she could get if she sold it. She decided to keep it. The computer sat hidden under piles of bedsheets, far from any windows, in a dark corner of my mother's room, a ghost of our need. My mother is radically honest, one of the few people I know who is incapable of lying. But it was an impossible choice. Obey the housing project's rules, don't go back to school, certain that path would mean no upward mobility and thus no way to leave public housing, or break the rules, work quiet and quick and hard, hoping the path she hacked in secret would allow some sort of escape. That spring, my mother got up at 5 every morning to work in the garden before she drove to her full-time job and then to class. When she finally came home, in the dusk, she worked in the garden again before coming inside to make my sister and me dinner, and then staying up to study and write papers. All this time, the children of the projects had watched her weed and water and seed with interest. And now they were here to join her. They came every afternoon, ringing the back doorbell. "Is the lady home? Is she going to work in the garden? Tell us when she gets home, okay? We want to work in the garden." I teased my mother about her fans, imitating their accents. She'd laugh a little, and then she'd invite me to join them outside. But I would always say no. I stayed indoors, in the rooms we kept dark, the air conditioning of the poor, heavy shades and high-powered fans, and listened to Bjork.
Bjork is a musical artist of that time. And so if it says that the air conditioning of the poor, heavy shades and fans, meaning they did not have air conditioning. That's the way that they stayed cool, is having shade and fans.
My whole life at that point was focused on proving that I did not belong to the poor. I doubled down on outsiderness. The weirder the affectations I adopted, the better.
So that says the weirder the artificial or faked displays I took on. So she is going to try to act different than she really is.
I saved for months to buy heavy men's Oxford shoes and wore only overalls and became the most devoted They Might Be Giants fan I could possibly be. All signifiers, I hoped, that I was smart and quirky, and most of all, objective, like all my classmates. When I came home from school in the afternoons, I remembered what was said about us, about the projects, about our poverty. My mother asked me if I wanted a plot for my pansies in her garden, and I said no. I wasn't brave, like her and those kids. I was ashamed to claim any part of this, to make it my own, to love it so hard as to seed it with flowers and patiently hope for them to bloom. The garden lasted a few months. Then, an agent of the town's housing authority found out about it and told my mother it was against the rules. "But no one's using the land," I remember her arguing. "The kids in the neighborhood play there." The response was clear. Get rid of the garden or be evicted. Here was another one of those impossible choices of poverty. This was what my classmates would never understand, as they earnestly debated welfare fraud and the grasping desperation of the undeserving poor. My mother stopped tending the garden, and the next weekend, a maintenance worker came and poured something onto the soil that made all the plants die and turned the grass brown. In September, I was back at that prep school, still obviously a scholarship student no matter what disguises I secured. The earnest debates in the halls had moved on to other topics because at that moment poverty was no longer news. But I was still shaking with rage.
So right here changes her feelings. At the beginning, it says that she was shaking and shaking and shaking, and she couldn't feel like she didn't know with what. Here she names it. She has rage, anger.
I didn't know what to do with it. I didn't even know yet that it was rage that made my voice quiver and come out small when I had to speak in class. Every morning, I passed the big floral arrangements that sat on the chestnut tables outside of the sleek, walnut-lined school office. I'd sneak a hand underneath their leaves, break the heads off the heaviest blooms, and ball the petals up until my fists smelled like roses.
All right. Okay, so we're going to start with some of these questions over here. Firstly, who are the characters that you noticed in this text? So you might want to name 2 to 3 characters that you noticed in the text. We are then going to highlight details that tell you about the setting. That's where and when the story takes place. Please highlight that in blue. So for example, I would highlight where and when. So right here it says mid-1990s. So you could highlight that. Make it blue. I know that she says she's 14 somewhere. So make sure you don't get confused with this date, 2016. That's the date that she wrote it, but it happened earlier than that. I mean, the school would be a setting at a school. I know later she calls it the prep school, though, so we could probably use that instead. Right here, it talks about the housing they lived in. That's definitely one of the settings in here. When I was 14, that gives us, the time of it. And then I would say the garden would be another setting in here. A circle of lawn along the parking lot. The only thing I would add is that prep school. I think that's back up here. Yeah, in September, I was back at that prep school. Good. So we need to copy and paste 3 details that tell us about the setting. So pretty much just pick 3 of those things you highlighted and copy them into this section here. Once you're done with that, click next. So we are going to be focusing more on the setting of the garden for this lesson. So we're going to review these paragraphs. These are the scenes that take place in or about the garden setting, and we're just going to work with these paragraphs today. So who are the characters that are involved with the garden? So who is involved with the garden? So if we go down here, they're probably talking about the kids, and then obviously the main character who's involved with the garden, the mom. So what are the most important events that occurred during these scenes in the narrative? Write 3 sentences to summarize these events. So looking at these paragraphs, 10 through 18, paragraph 10 starts about here, 10 through 18, okay? And then go down to 22. Starts there, 22, 25, and then 27 to 29. So read over those paragraphs and what are the most important events that occurred? Write 3 sentences to summarize those events. When you're done with that, click hand in. All right, working with those same paragraphs, based on what we've highlighted, was the garden important to the mother? So you're going to want to have, let's use race for this answer to first restate and answer the question. So was it important? Was it not important? Then cite text evidence. Okay, so you can copy and paste that from the paragraph. Make sure you have a sentence starter. So like the author writes or the text says. And then you need to explain how does that quote show that the garden was important to the mom. Make sure you have all those pieces for that question. You're going to skip question 2, moving on. Based on what you've highlighted, was the garden important to the neighborhood kids? Copy and paste one piece of evidence and explain your answer. Again, use race. Okay, restate and answer that question. Was it important or was it not important? Cite a piece of text evidence and explain how that evidence shows if the garden was important or not important to the kids. And you're going to skip question 2 here. All right, last time we're doing this. Was the garden important to the narrator? This might be a trickier one to get. So we see that she doesn't help with the garden. Her mom asks her if she wants to help, but she says no. But the reason she says no is because she doesn't want to feel like she belongs to this world of being poor. So what you could say here is that she has mixed feelings about the garden. The narrator has mixed feelings about the garden. I would say she sees its importance, but is ashamed to be part of it. So then you need to finish that up by citing evidence and then explain how that evidence shows that she's ashamed but sees the importance of it. A big question is, why do you think the author tells the story? Like, what's the point? Well, she starts off this essay by talking about what people think a welfare queen is, and it's all those stereotypes, right? But then what she does here is she gives a description of her life and her parent and her mom and what they do, even though they're on welfare. So what's that going to do to somebody that holds these stereotypes? Hopefully prove them wrong, right? So talk about that for this answer. Trying to break these stereotypes, trying to show people that not everyone on welfare is a certain way. Answer that number 2 next, and then click hand in. Now that you're done, let's click to number 4. So just some quick polls here. Poll 1, why did the narrator's mother create and take care of the garden? Was she holding on to her past life when she was in the middle class? Was it a distraction to keep her from being upset about how things were going? Was it a way to accept a new place and make it feel more like home? Was it making an effort to bring the community together? or something else. And there's no wrong answer. This is just your opinion on why you think the mother took care of the garden. And then also same thing here. There's no wrong answer, but why didn't the narrator become involved in the garden like her mother and like the other kids? Because she was embarrassed by their new home and way of life, because she felt like people at the school would judge her, because she was jealous of the relationship between her mother and the kids. She wanted to have her identity be associated with other things instead, or maybe something else. Complete those 2 polls and then hit hand in. Moving on to activity 5. So we're going to use the narrative techniques that we've talked about to develop a specific place and time in our lives and use descriptive details that reveal emotion. So now, so think of a place where you have felt really comfortable or a place where you felt really uncomfortable. Take a moment and think about a place that you could write about. Consider these 2 questions. Is there a specific sequence of events that would best reveal your feelings in the setting that you've chosen? And can you think of any descriptive details that could be relative to your narrative? We've just read a narrative about a place that makes the author uncomfortable, but brings great comfort to other characters. When you're doing your writing, think about the decisions that the author made in choosing to include characters doing and saying certain things to reveal their feelings about the garden. Now it's your turn to try to use the same technique. So you need to think of a place to write about, picture what this place looks like, remember what this place smells like, imagine the sounds that you hear in this place, identify your feelings about the place you're going to write about, and then have an idea about how to show your feelings through what you did and said in that setting. So remember, you don't want to say I felt happy. You want to show us how you felt happy. So I'm going to copy this down. Hit that number 2. And your prompt is think of a place where you have felt extremely comfortable or extremely uncomfortable and write a narrative. Narrative just means a story. Write a story about one moment in that place. So if you're talking about your lake house, you need to talk about one specific day at your lake house. Or if you're talking about going to a friend's house, talk about one day you went to your friend's house. And you need to use descriptive details. So here are some things to keep in mind: what it smells like, what you heard, your feelings about it, and how to show those feelings. You're going to write for 10 minutes. Set a timer for 10 minutes and do that writing now. Now that you're done, go ahead and click hand in. If you are at home, I believe you are not going to do the 6. Moving on to number 7. Okay, even if you are at home, you're going to do number 7. Your original writing prompt should be here. So in my writing, I wanted my readers to know that I felt. Do you want your readers to know that you felt comfortable or uncomfortable? What did you say or do in your narrative that was intended to reveal your feelings about the setting? So if you picked comfortable, where did you write something that shows that you're comfortable? If you are uncomfortable, where in your writing does it show that you are uncomfortable? Then answer, do you think it's helpful to a reader when a writer uses dialogue and action to show what a character is thinking? Explain your ideas there. Pause the video and answer those questions. Once you're done, move on to number 8, the exit ticket. This is a 2-part question. Part 1, how is the narrator's attitude toward the garden best characterized? The narrator would be who's talking in this reading. Is she excited about the garden, angry, doesn't care about it, or embarrassed? If you had to pick one of those. And then choose a quote that best supports your answer. Okay, so once you pick one of these, which quote shows that? Click hand in, and you are going to be doing the solo. This is like a quiz. And that is it for today. Please email me if you have any questions.